1. Chapter 1. Scientology, the Hidden Remote Viewers Factory. The core analysis. Why the military would have weaponized Scientology overnight, if the claims were real. Let's move beyond the rhetoric and examine the scenario with the cold logic of military intelligence. If Scientology's L rundowns truly produced stable exteriorization with full perceptics, the implications would be nothing short of revolutionary. 1. The military doesn't ignore useful tools, ever. The U.S. intelligence community has a long history of exploiting even the faintest possibility of unconventional advantage. Psychic research, Stargate Project. LSD experiments, MK Ultra. Remote influence attempts. Behavioral conditioning. Hypnosis. Sensory deprivation. And every fringe idea that could offer a 1% edge. If Scientology had even one demonstrable case of reliable exterior perception, the CIA would have classified the tech, seized the materials, recruited the auditors, and integrated the process into black budget programs. The U.S. government has never been shy about appropriating private sector breakthroughs. They would not have left this one untouched. 2. A Class 12 auditor would become a strategic asset. If a single auditor could consistently trigger out-of-body perception, remote viewing, or non-local awareness, that individual would instantly become more valuable than any weapons engineer or intelligence analyst. They would be protected, funded, monitored, and placed under national security protocols. Me, with my training, or anyone capable of producing such results, would not just be wealthy. I would be a state-level resource. Governments don't negotiate with miracles. They acquire them. 3. The global arms race would shift overnight. If Scientology could mass-produce remote viewers, the consequences would be immediate. Russia and China would infiltrate FLAG. Intelligence agencies would compete for access. Defense contractors would attempt to replicate the process. Black Ops units would be formed around Perceptics operatives. Entire branches of military doctrine would be rewritten. The Cold War would have taken a completely different trajectory. But none of this happened. 4. The silence speaks louder than the claims. No classified program. No government partnership. No covert funding. No military adoption. No measurable results. The absence of interest from intelligence agencies is not a coincidence. It is the most damning evidence of all. If the product worked, the world would look different. Since the world looks the same, the conclusion is unavoidable. 5. The real question. And this is where my article hits its deepest point. If Scientology truly had the ability to create remote viewers, why has no government ever cared? And what does that tell us about the gap between the promise and the reality? 2. Chapter 1. The promise that should have changed everything. For most people, Scientology's mythology revolves around auditing, past lives, and the elusive climb toward operating Thetan levels. But buried beneath the public-facing narrative lies a far more explosive claim, one that, if taken literally, would place Scientology at the center of the most coveted capability in the history of intelligence operations. The claim is simple, bold, and staggering. The L rundowns were designed to produce individuals capable of stable exterior perception, effectively operational remote viewers. This wasn't whispered in private. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a fringe interpretation. Hubbard himself framed the Ls as the gateway to a state where perception is no longer bound to the physical body. A state where awareness extends beyond walls, distances, and physical constraints. A state that, in military terms, would be indistinguishable from non-local reconnaissance. And this is where the story becomes interesting, because if the claim were true, even partially, Scientology would not be a religion, a movement, or a self-help system. It would be a strategic asset. The unspoken implication. If the Ls could reliably produce exteriorization with perceptics, then Flag, the only place on Earth where the full L rundowns are delivered, would be a training center for non-local operatives, a controlled environment for cultivating extrasensory intelligence assets, and effectively, a remote viewer factory. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The kind of facility that intelligence agencies dream of discovering and immediately classify. The scale of the claim. To understand the magnitude of this, imagine a single individual capable of perceiving inside restricted buildings, observing distant locations without travel, gathering intelligence without risk, and accessing information beyond physical reach. Now imagine producing hundreds of such individuals. That is the scale of what Hubbard implied. And yet, despite the enormity of this promise, something doesn't add up. The missing evidence. Across decades of L rundown completions, no documented remote viewing successes, no verifiable demonstrations, no controlled tests, no measurable results, no intelligence breakthroughs, no operational use cases. Not one. The silence is deafening. Because if the tech worked, even inconsistently, the world would have noticed. The intelligence community would have noticed. History would have noticed. Instead, we are left with a paradox. A promise powerful enough to reshape global intelligence, and a complete absence of proof. This is where the investigation truly begins. 3. Chapter 2: Why Intelligence Agencies Never Knocked on Flag's Door. If Scientology truly possessed the ability to produce stable remote viewers, the world's intelligence agencies would have been the first to notice. And yet, across decades of Cold War paranoia, black budget experimentation, and relentless pursuit of unconventional advantage, no agency ever approached Flag. Not the CIA. Not the DIA. Not naval intelligence. Not the Russians. Not the Chinese. Not even fringe defense contractors. The silence is absolute, and that silence demands an explanation. 1. Intelligence agencies investigate everything, except this. During the Cold War, the U.S. intelligence community pursued every imaginable edge. Psychic spying, mind influence experiments, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, LSD as a truth serum, remote viewing protocols, even attempts at telepathic communication. If a rumor existed, they evaluated it. If a claim surfaced, they investigated it. If a fringe idea had even a 1% chance of being real, they funded it. And yet Scientology's most extraordinary claim, stable exterior perception, never triggered an inquiry. Not a memo. Not a briefing. Not a classified evaluation. Nothing. This is not an oversight. It is a verdict. 2. The intelligence community has zero tolerance for unverifiable claims. The CIA doesn't care about philosophy, religion, or metaphysics. It cares about results. If a capability cannot be demonstrated under controlled conditions, it does not exist. Scientology never produced a testable remote viewer, a replicable demonstration, a measurable perceptual anomaly, or even a sole case that survived basic scrutiny. The intelligence community doesn't chase fantasies. It chases data. And Scientology never provided any. 3. The L rundowns were never operationally validated. For a capability to be considered militarily relevant, it must pass 3 tests. Reliability, can it be reproduced? Stability, does it persist under stress? Operational value, does it outperform existing methods? The L rundowns fail all 3. Results vary wildly. Exteriorization collapses under pressure. Perceptions are subjective, inconsistent, and unverifiable. No 2 auditors produce the same outcome. No 2 PCs report the same phenomena. From an intelligence standpoint, this is not a capability. It is noise. 4. The cost-to-value ratio is absurd. Even if the Ls worked occasionally, the economics alone would kill the program. Training a remote viewer through Scientology would cost tens of thousands of dollars in auditing, months of preparation, specialized staff, and a highly controlled environment. Meanwhile, the CIA's Stargate project produced remote viewers for a fraction of the cost, and even those results were deemed too inconsistent to justify continued funding. If Stargate were too unreliable, Scientology's Ls would be considered operationally useless. 5. The intelligence community knows a cult when it sees one. This is the part no one says aloud, but every analyst understands. Intelligence agencies avoid organizations that cannot separate belief from evidence. Scientology's internal culture is hierarchical, doctrinal, insulated, hostile to external scrutiny, and deeply invested in protecting Hubbard's mythology. This makes it the worst possible environment for producing intelligence assets. No agency would risk embedding operatives in a system where information is tightly controlled, loyalty is enforced, and psychological pressure is constant. FLAG is not a training ground. It is a closed loop. 6. The absence of interest is the conclusion. If Scientology had even a single demonstrable remote viewer, the intelligence world would have reacted instantly. Instead, it reacted with indifference, silence, and total lack of engagement. This is not because they missed something. It is because there was nothing to miss. The intelligence community is not blind. It is not naive. It is not easily fooled. If the L rundowns worked, the CIA would have been at FLAG's door before the ink dried on the first success story. They never came. And that tells us everything. 4. Chapter 3: The Myth, the Market, and the Mirage. If Scientology never produced a single verifiable remote viewer, the obvious question is, how did the myth survive? How did a capability with zero empirical support become one of the most coveted, expensive, and symbolically powerful promises in the entire movement? The answer lies in a 3-part mechanism that Scientology has perfected over decades. Myth, Market, and Mirage. 1. The myth, a promise too powerful to question. Every successful belief system contains a central myth, a story so compelling that it becomes self-protecting. For Scientology, the myth is simple. You can transcend the physical universe. Exteriorization. Perceptics. Awareness without limits. The idea that the mind, or the thetan, can operate independently of the body. This is not just a spiritual claim. It is a superpower. And superpowers don't need evidence to survive. They need desire. The L rundowns, with their aura of exclusivity and their whispered reputation aboard the Apollo, became the ultimate embodiment of that desire. A promise of transcendence wrapped in technical language. A myth disguised as a procedure. 2. The market, selling the impossible at premium prices. Where there is a myth, there is a market. Scientology monetized the Ls with surgical precision. Limited availability. specialized auditors, high prerequisites, escalating costs, and the implication that only a select few could manage the power. This is classic scarcity economics. The rarer the product, the higher the price. The higher the price, the stronger the perceived value. The stronger the perceived value, the less likely the buyer is to question the results. In any other industry, this would be called luxury branding. In Scientology, it is framed as spiritual advancement. But the mechanics are identical. 3. The mirage, results that can never be measured. The brilliance and danger of the L rundowns lies in their measurability. Exteriorization with full perceptics is subjective, internal, unverifiable, and impossible to evaluate under controlled conditions. This creates the perfect mirage. If it works, it's a miracle. If it doesn't, you have more case to handle. If you fail, it's your fault. If you succeed, it's Hubbard's tech. A self-sealing system. The mirage is not that the ability exists. The mirage is that failure is never attributed to the method. This is why the myth survives. This is why the market thrives. This is why the promise remains untouched. The paradox at the heart of the mirage. The L rundowns are sold as a path to superhuman perception. But the moment you ask for evidence, the narrative collapses into metaphor. The ability is always just around the corner, almost reachable, nearly attainable, but never demonstrated. A horizon that moves as you walk toward it. This is the essence of the mirage. Why the mirage works? Because it offers something no intelligence agency, no government, no scientific institution can offer. The promise that you, personally, can become extraordinary. Not through training. Not through technology. Not through genetics. But through spiritual engineering. It is the ultimate form of empowerment. And the ultimate form of control. The final twist. The myth persists because it cannot be disproven. The market thrives because the product cannot be delivered. The mirage endures because the horizon never stops moving. And that is why Scientology never needed to produce a single remote viewer. The promise alone was enough. 5. Chapter 4: The Economic Paradox, Billions Spent, Zero Results. If Scientology's L rundowns truly produced stable exteriorization with full perceptics, the global intelligence landscape would look radically different. But instead of producing remote viewers, the Ls produce something else entirely. A multi-billion-dollar revenue stream. This is the paradox at the heart of Scientology's hidden remote viewer factory. The more money people spent chasing the ability, the clearer it became that the ability never materialized. 1. The price of a miracle. The L rundowns are among the most expensive services in Scientology's entire catalog. A full set of Ls can cost tens of thousands of dollars in auditing, thousands more in prerequisites, additional fees for intensives, and mandatory stays at Flag, the most expensive org on earth. For many parishioners, the total investment reaches 6 figures. And what do they receive? Subjective experiences, emotional catharsis, temporary euphoria, and a promise that the real breakthrough is still ahead. But never, not once, the advertised ability. 2. The economics of escalation. Scientology's financial model is built on a simple principle. The next level will deliver what the previous level didn't. This creates a perpetual escalation. If Clear didn't give you perfect recall, right pointing arrow, you need OT. If OT-I didn't give you exterior perception, right pointing arrow, you need OT2. If OT2 didn't give you stable perceptics, right pointing arrow, you need OT3. If OT3 didn't give you freedom from the body, right pointing arrow, you need the Ls. If the Ls didn't give you full exteriorization, right pointing arrow, you need more Ls, more intensives, more reviews. The product is always just out of reach. The solution is always more auditing. The cost is always rising. This is not a spiritual path. It is a revenue ladder. 3. The billion-dollar mirage. Across decades, Scientology has generated billions of dollars in revenue from services that promise superhuman perception, telepathic awareness, freedom from physical limitations, and abilities indistinguishable from remote viewing. Yet the return on investment in measurable terms is zero. No remote viewers. No exteriorized operatives. No perceptual breakthroughs. No demonstrations under controlled conditions. Billions spent. Zero results. This is not a coincidence. It is a business model. 4. Why the paradox persists. The paradox survives because the product is non-falsifiable. If you don't achieve the promised ability, you have more case. You need more auditing. You hit a bypass charge. Or you aren't ready yet. The failure is never attributed to the tech. It is always attributed to the customer. This is the perfect economic engine. Infinite demand. Infinite upsell. Infinite deferral of results. A miracle that never arrives is more profitable than a miracle that does. 5. The hidden cost, opportunity. If Scientology's claims were real, the organization would be funded by governments, protected by intelligence agencies, integrated into national security programs, and operating under classified protocols. Instead, it is funded by parishioners who pay for abilities that never manifest. The opportunity cost is staggering. Billions spent on spiritual engineering. Zero spent on scientific validation. Zero spent on operational testing. Zero spent on proving the claims. The world's intelligence agencies didn't ignore Scientology. They simply saw nothing worth pursuing. 6. The final equation. When you strip away the mythology, the rhetoric, and the spiritual framing, the numbers tell a simple story. If the Ls worked, Scientology would be a global intelligence asset. Since they don't, Scientology is a global revenue machine. The economic paradox is not a mystery. It is the business model. 6. Chapter 5, The Final Verdict, What the Myth Reveals About Scientology's Core. After examining the claims, the economics, the psychology, and the complete absence of measurable results, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The myth of Scientology as a remote viewer factory reveals far more about the organization's inner architecture than about any actual ability. It exposes the logic that drives the movement, the mechanisms that sustain it, and the worldview that shapes every promise Hubbard ever made. 1. Scientology is built on the power of the unprovable. At the heart of Scientology lies a paradoxical engine. Promises too extraordinary to evaluate. Abilities too vague to measure. Breakthroughs too subjective to verify. This is not a flaw. It is the design. The unprovable is the perfect product. It cannot be falsified. It cannot be delivered. It cannot be refunded. And it can always be sold again. The myth of exterior perception is not an anomaly, it is the blueprint. 2. The organization thrives on aspirational identity. Scientology does not sell abilities. It sells identities. The identity of someone who transcends the physical universe, perceives beyond the body, operates outside MEST, commands spiritual power, and stands above ordinary humanity. This identity is intoxicating. It is aspirational. It is addictive. And it is far more valuable, economically and psychologically, than any actual ability could ever be. The myth of the remote viewer is simply the most extreme expression of this identity. 3. The tech is secondary, the narrative is primary. If the L's worked, Scientology would be a classified military asset. If the L's failed, Scientology would collapse under its own promises. The solution is elegant. Keep the narrative alive. Keep the results ambiguous. And keep the customer invested. The tech is not the product. The story is the product. A story in which you are special. You are powerful. You are on the brink of transcendence. And the next level will finally deliver what you've been chasing. This is not deception. It is mythology. 4. The myth protects the system. The myth of the L's as a gateway to superhuman perception serves a structural purpose. It justifies the cost. It elevates the status of flag. It reinforces Hubbard's authority. It keeps parishioners striving. And it prevents disillusionment from collapsing the system. A miracle that never arrives is more stabilizing than a miracle that does. Because a delivered miracle ends the journey. A deferred miracle extends it indefinitely. 5. The final verdict. After all the analysis, the conclusion is clear. Scientology was never a factory of remote viewers. It was a factory of belief. A factory that produces certainty without evidence, identity without achievement, transcendence without demonstration, and loyalty without results. The myth of the L's reveals the core truth of Scientology. The power of the movement lies not in what it delivers, but in what it promises. And that is why the myth endures. Not because it is real, but because it is useful. Useful to the organization. Useful to the narrative. And for many, useful to the self. 7. Epilogue, the mirage that reveals the machine. In the end, the question was never whether Scientology could produce remote viewers. It never did. It never came close. And the intelligence community's indifference is the most conclusive evidence of all. But the real story, the one that matters, is what the myth itself reveals. It reveals a system built on aspiration rather than achievement. A structure that thrives not on results, but on the promise of results. A movement that survives not because its claims are true, but because its followers need them to be true. The myth of the hidden remote viewer factory is not a failure of technology. It is a window into the psychology, the economics, and the internal logic of Scientology. A logic where the impossible is always just one level away. Where transcendence is always almost within reach. Where the horizon moves exactly as fast as you walk toward it. And perhaps that is the final irony. The greatest power Scientology ever wielded was not the ability to create remote viewers, but the ability to make people believe it could. The factory never produced abilities. It was producing belief. And belief in the right hands is the most profitable product of all. Author's note: why this story matters. I did not write this to mock, to sensationalize, or to recycle old criticisms. I wrote it because I lived close enough to the machinery to understand how it works, and far enough away to finally see it clearly. The myth of the L's, the exterior, the perceptics, the hidden abilities. These were not fringe ideas. They were central pillars of a system that shaped lives, drained fortunes, and defined identities. This article is not about exposing a fraud. It is about exposing a pattern. A pattern where extraordinary promises replace ordinary evidence. Where spiritual ambition becomes economic fuel. Where the search for transcendence becomes a marketplace. And where intelligent, sincere people like you, like me, like many I've known, are drawn into a narrative that always moves forward, but never arrives. If this piece helps even one reader see the architecture behind the myth, then it has done its job. Because the truth is simple. You don't need exterior perception to see clearly. You just need the courage to look. Ignacio Tiddu.